First, I would like to introduce Cindy Lynch. Cindy, would you like to give us a brief description of your background?
Sure. Hi, I'm Cindy. I am General Counsel for Simplify Medical. Simplify Medical is a cervical artificial disc company in Sunnyvale, California, and we're currently working on 2 PMAs. And for those of you in the PMA world, you know that that's a long process, and we're luckily reaching the end of it. But before being general counsel here, first and foremost, I'm a patent attorney. I started as a patent examiner at the U.S. Patent and Trademark Office, worked as a partner at a law firm, and then in 2003 was approached by one of our clients to go in-house at my first medical device company. That company was Connor Med Systems. It was a drug-eluting stent company. Had a very exciting IPO and then exit. And then since the Connor time, I've been in-house patent counsel at 4 different medical device companies and done a lot of IP due diligence. So I hope that we'll be able to provide you with some interesting information today.
Excellent. Thank you, Cindy. And our next panelist is Ron Berenson. Ron should be joining us shortly. Ron is a wonderful entrepreneur who has founded several successful medical device and biotech companies. And he also has a medical degree from Yale. And I would also like to introduce Paul Grand. Paul, would you like to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everybody. Paul Grand. I was an entrepreneur turned venture capitalist and now run a medical accelerator called MedTech Innovator. So we basically are looking for the most promising companies all over the world, no matter where they're located, and doing everything we can together with our industry partners to make sure those technologies actually reach patients. So that company is called MedTech Innovator that I run. And we work with companies from the very early stage through the late stage. The venture firm that I worked for, RCT Ventures, also the full name is Research Corporation Technologies, is a venture firm that is pretty much founded based on intellectual property. So all the capital that RCT invests really came from in intellectual property generated all over the U.S. Really before even the buy-dual system. So anyways, that's enough about me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Paul. And I would also like to introduce our moderators. Our first moderator is Piers Blewett. Piers is a patent attorney and principal at Schwegman. He is a global patent fellow at the Federal Circuit Bar Association and a former chief patent counsel, general counsel, and vice president at Kimberly-Clark Corporation. Thank you for joining us today, Piers.
Great. Thanks, Michelle. Happy to be here and look forward to our conversation.
And Doug Portnow will also be moderating our discussion today. Doug is a registered patent attorney and principal at Schwegman, and he also has engineering experience in the medical device industry. Before entering the legal profession, Doug worked for over a decade in the medical device industry, holding engineering and management positions at startups and publicly traded companies. Thank you for being here today, Doug.
Thanks for having me.
And now let's get started with our discussion. So we'll have about 45 minutes of discussion, leaving time for audience questions at the end. To submit a question, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. Doug?
Okay, wonderful. Thank you for those introductions and welcome panelists. Paul, definitely good to see you again. Glad to talk to you. And Cindy, always a pleasure. And hopefully Ron will join us soon.
I'm here too.
Oh, well, thank you, Ron. Good.
Yeah.
We thought we might have lost you, but thanks.
No, just trouble getting through the airport, but I'm
okay,
here.
Great. Well, so just to kind of kick us off, I guess to put things in perspective, I'm sure our audience would be very curious to know, what types of deals you have done. Were they mergers, acquisitions? Were they private rounds of fundraising? Were they IPOs? And what was, what were the magnitude of the deals? So maybe Cindy, you've done a lot of diligence. What kind of deals have you worked on?
Okay, I mentioned that I worked at a company, Connor Med Systems, that went through an IPO. That was certainly an exciting experience. And that company, again, was acquired a couple years later by J&J for $1.4 billion. So that was a pretty big one. I was involved in a couple other potential acquisitions that fell through right before closing. They didn't fall through for patent reasons, I'll be glad to say, but they did fall through for other business reasons. And that's it for acquisitions and IPOs, but I've been involved in many, many financings and venture debt deals.
And what sort of range of dollar values were those?
Oh, I don't, in the 10, 20, 30 million range.
Okay, sounds reasonable. Paul, how about you? I know you've done a lot of transactions. Maybe you can give us just sort of an overview of what kind of deals you've been involved in.
Sure, Doug. So most of the transactions that I've been involved with when I was, at the venture firm at RCT, were always in kind of that early stage range. So, those are typically financings that, are in the either the single digit or low 2-digit kind of financing. So, 2 million, 5 million, 7 million, 10 million, that kind of a range, usually for the total financing. And our portion of that was really some chunk of that, not the whole thing in most cases, although occasionally. And as a firm, generally speaking, the types of transactions that, go to exit in the medtech space, and especially, I think ones that we're involved with tend to be ones that, again, that were in that, sub $100 million kind of range and maybe less than that. So, that's the overall range.
Okay, well, that's a wide range. And Ron, how about you? What kind of deals have you been involved in?
Well, I've spent most of my career in the biotech industry, not as much in the med tech industry. And so it's a little bit different. But I've been involved in deals where we do partnerships. In my first company, we did a partnership with a large company for our drug to be for European rights. And then I've been involved in distributor type deals as well. And then I've been involved in a lot of fundraising with venture capitalists, angels, and other investors over the years. So kind of a wide range of different kinds, but no major exit. We had a opportunity for a large exit, but unfortunately our board decided not to do it in one of our companies. So I've been in, at the altar, let's say, but not quite there.
Okay, well, good. It definitely sounds like we've got a good set of panelists with a broad variety of experiences. So we look forward to hearing some more insight. So I guess, for me, the bottom line or the whole point of this webinar is really to find out, does IP matter when you're raising money or going through an exit? And I'm just curious, panelists, maybe Ron, we can start with you because I know you've had some opinions about this. Does IP matter in a transaction? Can you give us some examples maybe where IP helped you get through a deal, or maybe an example where IP hindered or held up the deal?
Well, I think our first company, CellPro, is a pretty famous case where there was a patent that was owned by Baxter that several of the board members wanted to fight Baxter. It was one of the key components of our technology. And, Baxter was willing to settle, but it was a little too high for our board. So, the scientific and medical group, and I was part of both those, felt there was a 50-50 chance of losing. And we learned the hard way after I left, because I didn't want to go through it, that you're better off settling than fighting, especially with a big company like Baxter. You spend a lot of legal fees and a lot of efforts, and you're probably going to lose, even if you're right. So I've seen that unfortunately occur. And then on the other side, I've also had technologies where we have very, very novel approaches where, and strong IP, where I think it's helped us do deals. And so I've been on that side too. But one thing I'd say is, as a former patent attorney who worked with us said, you know, and I always do this, is if there's a patent out there, you license it. Do not try and say it's not relevant, because, you know, I learned that the hard way. So that's a lesson I would say for me.
Do your homework, in other words.
Well, even if you do your homework and you find a patent and it's issued, do not fight that patent. You may win, but there's a very good chance you're going to lose if it's issued. And you're better off licensing it than trying to fight it. That's a point I would make. Mm-hmm.
Okay, interesting. Yeah.
Yeah.
Cindy, how about you? It sounds like you mentioned a few deals where IP was not an issue, and those deals died for other reasons. But were there any IP issues that came up during your transactions?
Yeah, so I guess the big one that comes up is freedom to operate.
Mm-hmm.
Other issues that come up are usually pretty easy to address, but when freedom to operate is the issue, due diligence can be hard and long. You have to get the investor or the acquirer comfortable with your positions on freedom to operate. And that's particularly difficult when you don't want to share attorney-client privilege information. So you don't want to share your opinions that you may have for your outside counsel. You might not even want to admit that you have those opinions, but you want to get them comfortable that you have good arguments for either invalidity or non-infringement of whatever patents have come up. In the one situation at Connor Med Systems when J&J was acquiring them, everything was pretty out in the open because we were at that time, I think, already involved in litigation in 4 different countries. So even if there are major issues, that doesn't have to kill the deal, but you have to be willing to spend the time to go through it with the other side's counsel and really get them comfortable with all, you know, you'd have to have your ducks in a row and be able to get them comfortable with your position.
And just to clarify, can you just tell us a little bit what freedom to operate is?
Oh, sorry. When you are when you're going through due diligence, often the investor, the acquirer, will do a search of what patents to find patents that may be closest to your technology, and their concern is whether somebody has an infringement case that they could bring against you.
Okay, thanks.
And Cindy, just to segue off that, when do you feel the freedom to operate review should be done? Like really early on, or a bit later on, once there's sort of more engagement from investors, or any sense on that?
So I've been in financings where there's a lot of focus on freedom to operate, and other ones where the investor doesn't do any. It kind of depends, often depends on what stage the company is at. If this is your A round or an angel investment, there's probably a lot of IP work that needs to be done at that stage so that the investors can get comfortable with the patent position. Because this is a new technology or a new company, and all those issues are not flushed out. But by the time you get to a B or a C round, you've been through this a couple of times, and sometimes you can get the investors comfortable that there's not a problem without going through any long process. I'm not sure if that answered your question.
No, it does.
Okay.
That's most helpful. And Paul, just in a general sense, from your experience, any thoughts on what types of inventions should be patentable or technology should be patented? Some less critical, more critical? What types of stuff have you seen?
Sure. So To begin with, I just want to also throw in just one minor comment on the last question about, whether IP matters. And, I just wanted to throw in something from the investor side that I can share, and that's that there are a lot of firms out there that IP doesn't matter that much to, and that they say as long as someone kind of has a license to hunt, they're not really as worried about IP because IP can be engineered around. You kind of have to hear those things. But when it comes to some of the firms like the one that I work for, RCT, at that firm we really believed that IP mattered tremendously, because ultimately the acquirers are making a build or buy decision, and that IP is a big part of that decision. So maybe with that context, coming back to what should be patented. So there's a couple different areas. I focus on med tech, diagnostics, digital health, and by med tech I mean devices. And so in that space, we're really looking for the utility of the technology to be patented. We want to see broad claims, as broad a claim as possible, related to to the actual device itself. On the software side, it tends to become a little difficult to get IP, obviously, and then so there's that introduces its own questions, and these days with algorithms and AI and other things, it's becoming harder and harder in that space. Ultimately, you heard the comment before about freedom to operate. That was always super important to us, and making sure that you're not infringing on someone's IP. And I think there's generally the sense among engineers or among builders that they're going to be constantly innovating and inventing new technologies. And we just want to make sure as investors then that whatever the novelty is, whatever the differentiator is, the key differentiator in the technology, that's covered. And the reason it was so important for us is that a lot of times devices don't wind up being the final device, that things actually get changed along the way. And sometimes devices get torn apart and rebuilt and after they've been acquired. And you want to still make sure that IP is still valuable, that you're covering the important aspect of the technology. And there's a lot more we could dig into the details on what to cover. But anyways, as much as possible, the key innovations should be covered.
That's great. And Paul, staying with you, because there's a nice build off that is, some of the listeners may be wondering how fast or slow they should progress their patent portfolio. So have you seen sort of countervailing things, like on the one hand, patent applications versus issued patents? Patent application, the claims are still somewhat malleable. You mentioned products could change, the claims could be adapted, versus the issued patent where the claims are fixed, but yet they're immediately enforceable kind of thing. Have you seen that sway any decisions or be important one way or another?
Well, I guess I'd say that I've definitely seen them evolve as you were describing. I've seen, patents broken up from the original, everything was in one big patent and then it's broken up into multiple ones. I've seen all sorts of things, but the evolution, I guess, for the original question of, how should the patent protection portfolio, go, for a particular company. I think, it's one of those things like many that people overlook often, and they don't come back to it often enough. As there's a lot of iteration that's happening in a device. So it's critical that the team that's doing the inventing and the development, even the manufacturing work, things that come up related to manufacturing that can be a huge advantage. And it's constantly, you want to have that loop, kind of like people talk about having marketing and sales looping back with engineering and development. Same thing on the IP side, that there, people need to constantly be checking in about what might have been invented along the way, who invented it, keeping track of who the inventors are. There's often a lot of people involved. Being pretty vigilant about that, especially with changes in, patent law, which I won't talk about myself. We'll have someone who's an expert in that. But I think it's just something that, it deserves a constant refresh. And, especially in the early stage, people are moving quickly, and they're not, and they often aren't, they do the quick freedom to operate search themselves often, or maybe at the university or wherever they happen to be. And then they don't, they might do an initial filing, and file their application, but they kind of feel like, oh, I did my IP now and I can go back to my development. And that's, to me, that's not the case. They need to constantly be looking at, what they're working on and how you might protect that.
Mm-hmm. And I'd be interested in the sort of staying with the coverage question or the portfolio management question. I'd be interested in all of the panelists' comments on this. But Cindy, perhaps I could start with you. What countries would you expect to see IP protection in, or where have you felt it important to file? Some listeners may say, "Well, US only, Europe." Where do I file? So, in your experience, Cindy, has that mattered? You know, have you looked internationally? Needed to go internationally? Thoughts on that?
Yeah. So all the companies that I've worked with do at least some foreign filing on at least on their core inventions or core technologies. It's not like the pharmaceutical area where they're filing in 20 countries. I almost never see that in medical devices. But on the core technologies, at least 3 to maybe 8 countries picking to foreign file. How to pick those countries? You can look at where your biggest foreign markets are if you know yet. I've often looked at some of the potential acquirers in the field, like if Medtronic is in your area, where does Medtronic file to get your main countries for filing. On the non-core technology, some of the ancillary stuff may be the instruments or the software, or some of the other things, the methods. I might only pick 2 or 3 foreign countries.
Gotcha. Ron, any thoughts your side versus the US versus international issue? Have you seen that come up?
Well, I have, because I'm in biotech and I've had biotech patent lawyers, and in our medical device company, we filed everywhere. And then Doug informed us with our second patent that we didn't need to do that. So I learned the hard way. So, but I learned the hard way. So I don't have a lot of expertise on medical device. I mainly rely on Doug for that.
Gotcha. Paul, how about you as an investor? Do you look for that global coverage, or mainly focus on US?
We definitely look for global coverage. Ultimately, we're looking for where this product is intended to be sold and marketed. So market access is a big part of this, and so we look at the requirements for those countries in terms of the clinical evidence, et cetera, and we also look at IP. And I know, for example, so we're involved with, in addition to my work as a venture capitalist for all those years, I'm now running this medical accelerator. We're involved with we have literally 1,000 companies buy to us in total this year between our US and Asia Pacific programs. And then within that, we have a cohort of 50 companies from the US that we ultimately accept in our accelerator, and 20 in Asia Pacific. And I just mentioned all that just to say that we look at IP, we look at all those things along this process. So in addition to my VC work, I can speak to also we just hear kind of in general from all these companies, all of whom are fundraising, all of whom are many of whom are different transactions. And the international patent coverage comes up quite a bit, especially as we have a number of partners and others who are that we know well, who are in places like Japan and other countries, and that that IP coverage in somewhere like Japan is very important. So I encourage people to broadly consider any of the markets where they might want to potentially sell this product, or they think an acquirer will want to sell this product, and make sure they've got coverage.
Right. Thanks, Paul.
Well, let's switch gears a little bit, and let me just ask a question about due diligence philosophy. So when I've done diligence, either representing an investor or sometimes a target company, occasionally the client will tell me, we want you to scorch the earth, we want you to find all the dirt, all the bad stuff, and we want to use that somehow to influence the deal. Maybe it's to lower valuation, or maybe it's to scuttle the deal, or who knows what. And I have done that, and we're pretty good at finding all the dirt and all the skeletons. But I also sort of feel like that's not a very good way of proceeding, because if you kill the deal, then nobody wins. And my personal philosophy is that it should be more of a collaborative thing. If you identify issues, try to work with the other side to resolve them, try to work them out. And you want the deal to happen that way. It's kind of win-win for the investor, and the target company. So just curious, you know, what others think about the philosophy going into these things. Is it, you know, take no prisoners, or is it collaborative? Cindy, you know, tell us a little bit about your experiences, perhaps maybe when Connor Med was going through diligence with the behemoth J&J.
That was a while ago, and I'm not sure I remember any specific details, but in general, I don't find that anyone wants the deal not to go through. The people are there because they want the deal to go through. So the due diligence tends to be pretty collaborative. That being said, you need to be honest in due diligence, but you don't want to be volunteering information. So when I have people in due diligence who are trying to not do the scorched earth approach, instead to come to me and say, well, you tell me what I should be looking at, I'm not going to tell them what they should be looking at. They need to do some of the work themselves, but I do want to speed things along. So it's kind of a balance there between being honest and answering the questions and just not giving things away or giving away attorney-client privilege kind of information.
Yeah. So you don't feel there's a obligate or duty of candor?
Yeah, no, to be honest, but not to volunteer information. And in certain circumstances, not even to provide the information they're asking for. Like if I have a potential acquirer who's asking me, tell me what your biggest freedom to operate issues are. That's not something that we can answer. We can say that we've done our analysis and we feel very comfortable that we don't have any issues, but we're not going to tell them what the biggest or way different patents that we've looked at.
Do you share a list of relevant references with the other side?
I have, in order to speed things along, particularly if it's a financing and we want it to move quickly and they're asking about freedom to operate searches that have been done in the past. If they're relatively recent, if we had another financing round that was, you know, relatively recent, if I could share a list of maybe patents from that and other patents that we've become aware of during past financings, without any comment, I will do that.
Okay, that seems like a pretty good compromise to me. It'll help speed the deal along. It's collaborative, and yet you're not waiving any attorney-client privilege issues or anything like that.
Yeah, that seems to work very well. And sometimes that can completely avoid them having to go out and do their own search. And ultimately, you're going to be probably paying their bill. So, so if you could save that money, that's helpful.
Yeah, definitely. Ron, how about you? Any thoughts on scorched earth versus collaboration on these things?
Well, I don't have that much experience. And my experience in this is that I find that investors, I'm sure that's not true of companies, but investors really don't focus enough attention that I've worked with on IP. They just kind of accept what you say, but that may be the investors I've worked with, but they've included, you know, some major VCs. I just don't find that they do as much diligence. Frankly, it almost makes me feel uncomfortable how little they do for making these big investment decisions. So I don't know. I haven't found I have to work that hard on maybe I've been lacking on the IP side in any of the companies I've been involved in. Just has not been a major issue.
You must have a very trustworthy face, I guess.
I don't know. I doubt it. I don't know what it is, but it's just been striking how, I mean, these are really smart guys and, you know, I'm dealing with, and it's like, you guys, come on, ask me some tough stuff about our IP and all the holes in it and what else we need to do, you know? Yeah, so.
Well, is that true, Paul? Do you just kind of listen to your attorneys and that's that is what it is, or do you dig in deeper, or how deep of a dive do you actually take on these things?
So, it all depends on the firm, Doug. So, RCT is super unusual. The first thing that they have all of the investment professionals do is take the patent bar review course. And then a lot of the people at RCT go on to, then sit for the exam and become patent agents, even though none of them practice. They just can. So that's something that, I think is really unusual. And so, as you might expect, they do that because RCT highly values IP, and does do a deep dive, does look very carefully at, at the patents and the landscape and the claims and so on. But I think that's pretty unusual. As I said, there were many times where, we didn't always, as I said, as investors, you're usually in a syndicate of some kind. And we would talk to other very large brand name firms, as you were just hearing, and you'd say, hey, and I'm really worried about the IP, and they go, we don't really care that much about IP. And it was really more of a box they were checking that they have IP versus, what the value of the IP was. And I think it was this, in the same way that a lot of venture firms, make decisions based on gut, if you will, or you've heard that, there's still that kind of thing still happens out there where people are like, it just felt right, and, we want to do this deal, versus all the, super detailed diligence. So it just depends on the style of the firm and the experience of the management team, or, how much they rule on gut. I personally am not a big fan of gut, although, maybe when it comes to things like management teams, but IP and other aspects, I like to get in pretty deep.
So are you actually a registered patent agent then, Paul?
So I am not. I would have said it as much if I was.
Oh, okay.
In my intro. But I'm not, only because I think I was just like a course or two short of the undergraduate courses that I needed to actually qualify to sit. But otherwise, I'm sure I would have passed it. I did that CD-ROM back in the days when there were CD-ROMs. I did the CD-ROM test and passed it. So I think I would have passed it.
Okay, we'll make you an honorary agent for today, at least.
Thank you.
But that is very interesting. I didn't realize that RCT required that of their analyst team. Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, good. So
I
how
can
much?
describe a little bit of a typical due diligence, and I think it goes kind of like Paul has described. Most commonly, the investor hires an outside patent counsel to look at your IP, and they look at 3 different areas. They look at your coverage, your patent portfolio. They look at ownership. Often they look at every single signed assignment of your IP, and they look at freedom to operate. And usually the review of your patents and the review of your ownership goes pretty quickly, and then freedom to operate, they've done some kind of search, and they come back to you with a list of patents that they would like to discuss with you. And then you and your outside counsel often get on a call with the investor's patent counsel to go over these patents that they flagged as relevant. And sometimes you bring a technical person along. And often, like Ron says, they don't know much about your technology. So the patents they pull up might be pretty far afield, and you might be able to dismiss them pretty quickly. And I've never really seen something that was shocking and new that comes out of these due diligence. But that's why you want to ask for the list that they want to discuss in advance, so you have a chance to look at those with your attorney.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And that's what I've seen. I've seen generally the attorneys that are doing it don't have a lot of background in your technology, so you have to bring them up to speed a little bit. And then if not a lot comes up, maybe you can get it over within one call, or maybe you need an actual in-person meeting or a couple of follow-up calls to go over more detail. But that's usually the process. It's tempting to, when they send you that list, to want to put everything down in a PowerPoint so you can show them how ours is different. But you want to resist doing that because that's attorney-client privilege, and you want to just go over on the phone where you think the differences are and how your technology is different, and try and get them on board that there's no issues.
Okay. We actually have a question right now, and it's quite relevant, so I'll just read it off if I may, and I think Cindy, if you want to address this. The question is, during due diligence, if the investor asks for the FTO opinions, what is the risk if you were to share them?
I think Doug Piers and you probably have the proper answer, the exact answer, but I say no, never. I wouldn't. That from my perspective would be too risky in breaking the attorney-client privilege. But I'd be interested to hear what you have to say.
Putting it back on the moderators. Thank you very much.
Because I would definitely ask my outside counsel.
Yeah. So in my practice, when that happens, you know, we're happy to share the list of relevant references with the other side. If they have questions, we can go through them. We would never share any written opinions. We might talk about some of the analysis, but again, you know, we're not going to get into all the nitty gritty with them. We'll tell them enough to satisfy them and answer their questions, but that's about it. I don't know, Piers, anything?
I agree. Yep. I think the discussion on the phone, as Cindy's alluded to, is exactly the right way, and I would not share opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
If I can comment on that, this is Ron. I have been taught by most patent attorneys not to get an FTA, freedom to operate, written opinion. First of all, it's very expensive, and now you've got people asking you for one, and it's much better that you don't have one. And most investors anyway are used to you not having a written opinion. They know that you're probably pretty smart if you don't have one, and that's my experience. And your attorneys can represent that without compromising you, if you will, by having documents around that have written opinions. It's I'm sure at some point that's necessary, maybe, but in the early stages of these companies, I think it's dangerous to have all these written documents. I don't know how the rest of the folks feel, but that's something.
Paul, what do you think? Do you expect to see written documents, or are these verbal conversations over the phone, are they adequate?
And that's a good question. You know, I'm trying to recall kind of what our policy was on that. We certainly had both. And I don't remember ultimately if we needed to see a written FTO or not in our transactions. That I can't actually recall. But I know that, you know, as I said, we've seen both. For sure had, you know, because a lot of times these, maybe the important thing is on the transactions that close, you know, in the ones where, you know, you're doing diligence along the way, and a lot of deals don't wind up closing, you know, for one reason or another, or, you know, you're doing the early work, and, you know, you're asking, is there a freedom to operate opinion? Who did that opinion? And they'll say, oh, you know, Schwegman, and you say, oh, that's great. Must be tremendous. But beyond that, you know, you don't necessarily get the written opinion always in hand at that early stage, but I'm pretty sure we always got some kind of a written opinion at some point. And as was mentioned before, I think by Cindy, you know, we also, when we go out to our own counsel, we didn't just trust the work, you know, necessarily blindly that had been done. We wanted to see what, you know, we wanted to see what our counsel thought as well. So we would also reach out to our counsel for those opinions as well, or hire outside counsel and then and pay them, you know, sometimes out of the transaction, sometimes, you know, ourselves.
Oh, so that's a good segue to the other question I had for the group, which is how long should this diligence process take, and, you know, how much are we talking about in terms of dollars? And it seems to me like I got the call on Tuesday from the investor or the client saying, oh, we're trying to close this thing on Thursday or Friday, you know, so then we get a very, very short window of time to work on these things. So we've got to hustle. But what do the panelists think about the timing, how long, and how much these things should cost? Cindy, why don't we start with you?
The cost and the time definitely are very related to the size of the deal. Yeah, an acquisition, you're going to be in IP due diligence at least a few weeks, probably more than a month, and in general due diligence for a couple months, I think. And in a smaller financing, it might go very quickly. There might be very little IP due diligence. But the cost is definitely an issue because most often you're going to be paying, the company's going to be paying the due diligence costs for the investor, not for the acquirer, but for the investor in the IPO, you're paying those costs. So anywhere you can limit them is helpful. And even putting a cap in the term sheet on how much you're going to pay is a good idea if you can get the investor to agree to that. And then your outside attorneys can probably help you with the amount that is a reasonable amount to set that cap. But the last time I did a deal with a cap on it, I felt much more comfortable with how long due diligence took and how much work was done, because we had kind of agreed in advance that this was an adequate amount of money to spend on due diligence.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because I've spent anywhere from low end of maybe $5,000 on a diligence. Obviously, that was a pretty simple one, all the way up to $300,000-$400,000 on IP diligence, which was very complex and took many months. How about you, Ron? Any thoughts on the timing and the cost for diligence?
Well, I don't have as much experience as some of the other people. As I said, in my experience, it's been very fast and very little money in financings and other deals I've done. So I don't have anything more to say than that.
Okay. I'm gonna hand it over to Piers for a minute.
Yeah, panelists, there may be listeners, I'm sure, on this call that are either in-house attorneys, let's say like Cindy, or at firms, or generally get involved or want to get involved in diligence. And for the attorneys out there, mindful or conscious of trying to add value and be useful, if you will, I would just go straight to the jugular and say, have you seen or experienced any very positive or very negative experiences with attorneys or law firms during a diligence that you'd care to share? And perhaps you could go, no, Cindy, I'll ask you first, and then turn to Paul and Ron. And don't spare any dirt. Would be all ears.
The one issue that I've struggled with outside attorneys over the years, and not recently, but over the years, is that freedom to operate opinion that I'm not providing. That has been the one issue that comes up time and time again, and I'm just not going to provide it. And sometimes it takes a while for the other side to come around to understanding that it's not coming no matter what. Yeah. So that's the one thing I can recall that I've struggled on. But other than that, I haven't really had any bad experiences.
That's good to hear. Paul, how about you?
I haven't had any bad experiences with attorneys during diligence in my transactions. So I got nothing negative to report.
Oh, good news indeed. And Ron, any thoughts your side where we can add value or make sure we get out of the way, those sorts of things?
For due diligence,
yes,
specifically?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I do like the idea, if you can do it, to collaborate as much as you can with the other side. That helps a lot. You know, if there's ways you can reach out and be involved with the other side of a transaction, I think that really helped me in one of the companies where, you know, it was with Eli Lilly, and they were, you know, and we had some issues, and they had an attorney, and our attorney talked, and it worked out really well. So I think that's one thing that I recommend, if you can, to reach out to the attorneys, because there's nothing like people talking to each other to understand each other.
That's good. Great, thanks, Ron. Then sort of expanding it a little more broadly and staying with each of you, what do you feel is more important in your experience sort of these four aspects, if you will, the clinical data or regulatory approval, reimbursement sort of scheme, or the IP? Cindy, any thoughts? Just trying to get a relative sense of the IP or versus the other issues that inevitably arise.
I think IP, it kind of comes at on a second tier. Certainly the regulatory timeline in medical devices is very important, and the market. And I would put those at the top of the list of things that people want to understand and be happy with first. And then they look at some of the more detailed things like the IP and the clinical data.
Gotcha. Paul, how about you? No, thanks, Cindy. That's excellent. Paul, your thoughts?
Yeah. So it's interesting. So from a transactional component. So if you're thinking of it like let's say an M&A transaction, for example, all these things are important. IP, will be really important, and it might be something that the other side looks at early on and says, we're really concerned about the IP in a particular area, and that's going to really affect whether or not buy this technology or in the first place. When it comes to the market access, the value of the technology, obviously the regulatory approval and clinical data is just critical. Like these days, as an investor, and maybe just in transactions in general, everything's about the value proposition and market access and the clinical evidence required to back up your claims. And even if you've got regulatory approval, whether it's a clearance or an approval, that doesn't mean you have the clinical data that's necessary to convince somebody to complete a transaction. So that's obviously a much longer topic than we have for today, maybe. But more and more often now, the thing that people are prioritizing in terms of the understanding of the ultimate cost of bringing this product to market and convincing people to adopt it, not just bring it to the market, but actually convince people to buy that product, is going to be clinical evidence. I think the regulatory approval obviously goes without saying. You have to have the ability to actually sell the product, but oftentimes we're also looking at consumer medical technologies that may not have your standard regulatory approvals. So then ultimately, if I had to finally make my my judgment call, it'd be somewhere between probably clinical evidence and coverage, because reimbursement coverage, because people have to be able to buy the product. So if there's not the economics in place to actually pay for the product, that's probably the most important thing.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Paul. Ron, any thoughts your side from the sort of relative value of these issues, or the most important thing that you've seen?
Yeah, this is something I do have something to say about. I think that it kind of will parallel a little bit the stages of the company and the markets you're targeting. But I will say, in general, most of the technologies and drugs that are out there primarily are variations of a theme. And the hospitals today, they don't really care if something is better if it costs more in general, unless it's dramatically better. And this was a fatal flaw that many of the VCs made in the late 90s and early 2000s, where they put tremendous amounts of money in what they thought were breakthrough technologies that weren't much better and were sold for much more than what existed. So you've got to be really careful about this issue of costs. It's becoming increasingly difficult if you're trying to enter a market, particularly hospital-based markets, if your product costs more. To quote a purchasing manager from a couple weeks ago, I don't care if it works or not. All I care about is what it costs. And we have a really pretty breakthrough product, but it doesn't matter if it costs more than what they're doing now. I'm just trying to be honest. It has to show either itself it's cheaper than what they have, or it's going to save the hospital money. And if it doesn't, it's a long, hard, tough road to get through. And I just can't overemphasize how important that is. The IP, for me, because I've been through so much over the years, good and bad, I feel it's important, but I feel it's important at a later stage. In general, when you've kind of proven yourself out a little bit in the market, you're selling your product, and now you're talking to more serious players, then I think that comes to the front for me. But I would stress that it's a stepwise process. When you start, it's, you know, do you have a market? Then it's, is there any evidence this thing works? And then it's like, well, the regulatory, and then it's the get into the payment systems, and then it's, you know, how do you get doctors to use it in the hospital, and then how do you get through that? So it kind of goes in a stepwise process over a number of years where investors are going to focus, and it'll be at various points in time. I think interestingly at the beginning, they do tend to focus more on the IP, and at the end and in between it, there's just a lot of noise. It seems like, oh yeah, you got a patent or whatever, let's move on. So it's kind of at the front end and back end where they really dig in on this. That's kind of what I've seen.
Okay, thanks, Ron.
Yeah.
We do have more questions, but just turning it back to Michelle for a moment. Just Michelle, any questions coming in that we should address?
Not right now.
Okay, perfect. Then I'd like to ask the panelists, just turning it on its head in some way. Have you ever used IP to reduce evaluation rather than sort of promote your, but have you, perhaps Cindy, I could start with you. I know you mentioned there were times where you perhaps looked at this assignment and you had the various 3 stages and so forth, but have there been times where you've sort of gone out or used IP to get the number down, so to speak?
Well, that's not the side of the equation I'm on. I'm looking to get the value up, but there was one situation where we were going out to license a patent. We had a search done and came across an interesting piece of prior art, which was able to significantly reduce the amount we had to pay for the license. So IP in those kind of circumstances can really affect the deal. But on the side of trying to increase valuation, I'm always trying to convince the acquirer, the investor, that our IP is actually worth more than they're thinking it is. And they have some kind of equation that they put together of each patent is worth this amount. And I'm trying to convince them, but actually our patents are worth much more because in our industry, for various reasons, these patents are, it never seems to work. They have their equation that they say each patent is worth this amount, and that seems to be where we come out over and over again. So, my 2 cents.
It's a side question there, Cindy. Do you know how they value, what ways have they valued that? Do they sort of look at market-related things or the cost basis, or any thoughts on that?
Most of the models I've seen are very, very basic. Look at the field and set a particular money value per patent. But I've seen some models that have a few other things that go into it, like if reimbursement is good, you get this multiple, or if, yeah. But I've really not seen a model that makes a whole lot of sense to value IP.
Gotcha. Paul, your thoughts on this? What have you seen in this area?
You know, it's funny. Well, I'll start with kind of like the story, that, we hear from people a lot, which is, when companies are pitching, oftentimes, as you probably know, companies will come in with their own valuation models. And they'll say, we had an independent valuation, done, and they valued our company at XYZ. And part of that will be the IP. And we generally completely discount that valuation assessment. And it's a shame that they've paid any money for it. Usually, I'm not sure who does those, but But the point is, that's something that, I've seen and heard a lot, where people come in and say, our IP is worth XYZ or whatever, or somebody else bought a patent for a certain amount, and so therefore our patent is worth an amount, and I rarely see that ever be the case. So oftentimes I think ultimately we always looked at it at our firm as discounting, based on risk. So we take we would do a calculation of what we think the company would be worth in an exit, which is the way ultimately I think a lot of investors think is, what's kind of the top line price that somebody might pay ultimately for this company if everything goes well. And whatever that number is, then you kind of do the backing into what the valuation should be for the company, the pre-money valuation, based on other rounds of financing that are going to take place and, dilute everybody, et cetera. So you just kind of back into what you think the valuation should be. And as part of that, you're discounting for risk as well. And so we'll say, if all things go well, here's what we think the valuation is. Based on the IP risk, we'll apply a percentage, and we'll say, the IP risk in this case, we've had a chance to look at the IP and read the opinions and talk to, other people and make our own assessment. And we think the IP risk is, 80%, or it's 80% confidence in the IP. If you want to go the other way, it could be 20%. But yeah, we'll have a confidence value or risk, a discounted value, and we apply that to pretty much everything, the regulatory approval and so on. So that's how we looked at things, was, not so much, we didn't assign a value to the IP, a dollar value. We used it, we would discount the, that we thought the total potential exit was in our models based on the risk that we assigned to the IP.
Gotcha. Ron, I think we have a couple of minutes. Any thoughts on using IP to reduce valuation, or your experience in that field?
Well, I think being data driven is important. If either you or through your connections, to obtain as much data as you can about what is a reasonable deal to do, and that's number one. I deal a lot with universities, and so if you have knowledge of what the landscape looks like in terms of what royalty rates and upfronts and milestone and all that, you can kind of say, here's the range, here's where I should be. So that's number one. The second point is that you need to understand in the way of IP what you need, and you can use that. You can say, look, well, you've got this patent, but I've got to license 2 other patents, and I can't pay a 12% royalty with all these different patents, and even with stacking provisions, it's way too high. We've got to be reasonable, or we just can't do a deal. So I think there's 2 ways that I use to negotiate, in terms of IP, but I deal mostly with universities.
Perfect. Thanks, Ron. Well, at this point, I'll turn it back to Doug if he has any final questions for the remaining couple of minutes, and then perhaps on to Michelle to close out. So thank you, Doug.
Okay, thanks, Pierce. Yeah, just if the audience has any questions, feel free to enter them into the chat room. We'll take a look at them. Final words of wisdom, final pearls. Cindy, Paul, or Ron, any last thoughts? Starting with you, Cindy.
Yeah, nothing else I can think of.
Okay. Paul?
Well, first of all, great webinar, great discussion, really interesting conversations. I really enjoyed this. I think, as I mentioned before, just take IP seriously, that it will, even if you're a short-term investor in your angel round or your Series A round or your Series B round or whatever round it is, even if they don't do too much diligence and think too much about it, I can promise you that the company that's acquiring you at some point will. If that's the eventual transaction, which they generally are. And so you should take it equally as seriously as they will, and be diligent about it. So that's my general advice. I'll also put in a plug for MedTech Innovator. Our applications are open as we speak for our 2020 cycle, and you'll get a chance to interact with lots of great people like Schwegman along the way, hopefully. So medtechinnovator.org is our website. And there's a big apply button on the homepage. So I would encourage you to apply. It's a no equity for participation, no fees to apply. We're just looking for great companies and trying to make them better.
And tell me, Paul, how much money have you actually given out over the last few years? It's quite a lot.
Yeah, no, we've given over, we've given non-dilutive funding in the couple million range to our startups, totally non-dilutive. And more importantly, the graduates of MedTech Innovators program have gone on to raise over 1.2 billion in follow-on funding. So it's a pretty good track record, and with about 260 alumni now, we've only had maybe under 8 companies, I think, that are no longer in business. So we've got a really good track record for great alumni. So it's a great program.
Super, that's very impressive. Ron, final words.
Well, my final words would be related to what we started with, freedom to operate. From my vantage point, there's nothing more important when you start a company to understand the lay of the land. And for you personally, if you're an entrepreneur, or if you're also working with your attorney, to work hand in hand to understand every patent that's out there that could be of value. And you cannot depend on your patent attorney to do it alone, because they don't have the background in the area that you're working in. And I see too many times where people try and depend on their attorney, and you give them the information, then you have a dialogue. You don't go, oh, can you start looking for stuff? So that's number one. And as I said earlier, number two, do not think that you can just ignore a patent. What I do is, if there's a patent that speaks right on what I'm going to do, I license that patent, or I find a way around it, but I do not ignore it. I've seen board members and others go, oh, we're going to beat that. And of course, as I said, it destroyed my first company, but I've heard that even in my current company from a board member. And I'm like, I don't do that. That's not a good way to be. So from my vantage point, in terms of IP, freedom to operate is key. I'll also put a plug in, but not for myself, for Doug. I've worked with all the big firms, not that they aren't, but Cooley and Wilson Sonsini and all of them. And Doug and his partner, Stephen, are by far the best patent attorneys I've ever worked with. I just cannot say enough good things about them. They're smart and they're on top of things, and that they keep us running rather than, usually I have to push the patent attorneys. That's not true with them. So anyway, I just want to thank Doug, and also thank everybody for being part of this wonderful discussion. I learned a lot today.
Okay, super. Well, thanks for the kind words, Ron. I'll send you the check afterwards. And panelists, really appreciate it. Thanks for everything. And to check out Simplify Medical, a very interesting orthopedic device. Check out Kytotech for some interesting wound care. And if you're a startup, check out the MedTech Innovator Program, very interesting. So thanks, everyone. That's it from me.